Hello, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to our next installment of our Lunch and Learn webinar series. Thank you so much, everybody, for those of you who are joining us live, and for those of you who are joining us later on by checking out our YouTube channel. Thank you for each and every one of you who continue to come back to this open platform for safe conversations on cultural safety, decolonization, and reconciliation with me and all of my friends and family at Len Pierre Consulting. If you are new here, welcome. Thank you for joining us. These sessions really are designed to make these conversations, these platforms, and learning opportunities more accessible to all of our friends and colleagues, no matter what your professional background is in. Education, healthcare, social services, justice, the private business sector. If you're a stay-at-home parent, no matter what your background is, we do see room for everybody in these spaces. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for being here and being present to listen, learn, and lean into these very important conversations. Today's session, today's Lunch and Learn hour is all about what I called in the promo material, my favorite tools for anti-racism work. And I'll share, I hope to offer you, plenty of tools that I feel like you can walk away with. But all of these sessions, these webinars that our team has been offering and hosting really are at least trying to offer three key areas. The first is greater awareness. The second is language that we feel like we could put in our professional tool belt. And the third would be those pragmatic strategies, everyday professional strategies that you feel like you can incorporate into your professional practice moving forward. When it comes to anti-racism tools, I want to be very clear and transparent that I am aiming to offer you some of my favorite tools that I've picked up just in the last 2 years alone. My background is primarily in the area of building education programs and services and professional strategies for Indigenous cultural safety. And it's been in holding spaces, educating and training professionals in all kinds of disciplines and professional domains about Indigenous cultural safety that I've started to pick up some anti-racism tools along the way. Indigenous cultural safety and humility is an outcome. And to get to that outcome, we will need a workforce that has professional anti-racism tools in their professional tool belt. That's how we will achieve that golden zone of culturally safer spaces for Indigenous peoples. And my intention with this bit of time that we have here today is to share with you some of the favorite ones that I've found to be the most useful. Whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, whether you've been doing this work for a very long time in terms of equity, diversity, cultural inclusivity, or you're very new, I find these to be the most accessible and meaningful tools that I've picked up along the way. And I've only been picking them up, I've only really been invested in this work for the last 2 years. The 3 years. I would say the global pandemic is when this work really started to pick up for not just me, and I know many of us who are invested in social justice work. A lot has happened in the last 2.5 years. If we look at the global pandemic and the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes that we are seeing in the news and in the media and in society today, if we look at the murder of George Floyd in the year 2020, summer of 2020, and Black Lives Matters and marches and demonstrations, both in Canada and the United States. And then, of course, in 2021 was the release of the In Plain Sight report, which highlighted the vast amount of widespread, deeply rooted, systemic anti-Indigenous racism in the healthcare system. Now, full transparency, every system in this country has its own In Plain Sight report coming. And we know this as Indigenous peoples. We know that widespread anti-Indigenous racism is in the education system, the social services system, the criminal justice system. You name the system in Canada, there will be widespread, deeply rooted elements of anti-Indigenous racism. And yes, I'm going to be very transparent with you. Transparency is like my corporate superpower. I can't really turn it off. There's also systemic racism that exists in our own Indigenous businesses, organizations, teams, and departments as well. There are elements of that because that is a residue or an impact, a residual impact of colonialism that's been passed on to us. So yes, we have our own internalized racism that we need to address and work within our own communities as well. So I just want to share that lightly and with humility for all of my Indigenous friends, relatives, and colleagues who are on the line or listening to this at a later date as well, that we have some work we need to do in our own teams and departments that are Indigenous led as well. And so we need these tools just as much as, we're asking our non-Indigenous colleagues to pick up and use these tools as well. And I offer that lightly and with humility. So I have, again, just as we do with all of our lunch and learn sessions in this series, about 40 minutes worth of my big talking head sharing with you some content. And then I hope to leave about 15 minutes or so with an open dialogue. And I would love to answer any questions that you would like to bring into the space here. The Q&A function is enabled, so you should be able to use that at any point to highlight a question that is coming up for you, and then I'll make sure that we have time to address that as we get closer towards the end of our time here together. So without further ado, bear with me 1 second here as I share my screen and bring up today's PowerPoint presentation. This PowerPoint presentation, for those of you who were with us in the allyship lunch and learn webinar episode. This is a course that my team offers at Len Pierre Consulting. We have a 3.5-hour course on Indigenous allyship and anti-racism. Usually a prerequisite to that course is Indigenous cultural safety and humility, because there's some foundational stuff that we as professionals need to know before we get to the let's be an ally, let's be anti-racist. We can't skip over the uncomfortable parts. So I would also just let folks know that we do have 2 courses, Indigenous Cultural Safety and Humility for teams and organizations. And then the second part to our last session that we had, Indigenous allyship and anti-racism. This is a course we offer for teams and organizations all across North America. I would like to open with this quote. Like fighting an addiction, being anti-racist requires persistent self-awareness, constant self-criticism, and regular self-examination. And this is often what we say within cultural safety as well, is that, it's not enough to be non-racist today. In fact, there's no such thing as being non-racist. If you are in this zone where people feel like they think they're being non-racist, what they're actually doing is passively accepting the racial injustice and intolerance that is so widespread through Canada, the United States, and many other colonial countries. So there's really no such thing as being non-racist. We can only be racist or anti-racist. And anti-racism is this active state of constantly addressing racism when it presents itself. And it presents itself more often than not in our society. And we'll talk more about those gaps in our awareness or things that we are not necessarily looking towards with our time and attention, where racism is actually happening. We'll try to uncover those within the time that we have here. So to begin our conversation, I need to start right from the very beginning and be very clear and very intentional that there are a lot of misconceptions about racism in this country, a lot. And if we don't nip these in the bud and talk about them, we're not going to get very far in our conversations. So I offer these to you as tools, like misconceptions. They can be tools in our professional tool belt. They can be tools because if we know that it's a misconception, we can name it as a misconception, a myth, a disinformation, and then we can address it moving forward. So it's important that if we don't address these 4 key barriers, usually they are used to get their tactics, their strategies to get racism off the table for discussion. And that strategy of removing them from the table for discussion makes Indigenous peoples erased, but it also perpetuates the status quo, which is colonialism, which is alive and well today too. So you've probably all heard some form or some examples of what's represented on the screen here. Again, if we can't nip these in the butt, we're not going to get very far with cultural safety, reconciliation, decolonization, or anti-racism work. So the first misconception is, proximity to Indigenous peoples. Proximity to Indigenous peoples is where people say things like, well, I don't need this anti-racism training. I don't need to know about cultural safety because I don't know any Indigenous people. And I'm like, okay, hold on, wait a second here. And people have openly said this to me. Doctors have come to me and they're like, Len, we don't need your cultural safety education or training. And I was like, oh, why is that? And this doctor told me, well, we don't have any Indigenous patients. And then I was like, okay, first of all, if we're saying that, aren't you very curious as to why there's no Indigenous patients accessing your clinic? And number two, we don't want to, deem what is an Indigenous person, what they look like or sound like when they're entering your office space, right? As Indigenous peoples, we come in all colors and shapes and sizes. And so we don't want to be very stereotypical in what we are deeming an Indigenous person to look like. So proximity to Indigenous peoples is irrelevant to anti-racism training and cultural safety training. People who work in facilities and they work in the facilities departments of large organizations will say, well, we just work with the buildings, we work with the mechanics and the infrastructure and the electricity. We don't work with people, so we don't need this anti-racism training. I'm like, yes, you do. So proximity to Indigenous peoples is irrelevant to anything in cultural safety, reconciliation, and decolonization. Nowhere in the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action does it say you need to know an Indigenous person to engage in this work. Pick the document in this country, Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action, the In Plain Sight report, the calls for justice from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry, you name it. All of these documents are less about the people and more about systems and how systems need to be re-examined, redesigned, more equitable and more just for Indigenous peoples. And every single one of us as citizens in this country work in that system. So this work is for us too. The second misconception is the idea that we just treat everybody the same. And that looks like or sounds like when people say things like, well, Len, I don't see color or I don't see culture. I just treat everybody the same. I'm okay. I'm safe. I'm like, the work that I do, I'm very comfortable just looking them in the face and being like, no, you don't. We don't treat everybody all the same. And, if you identify as a woman, I can safely say that experience, right? You are not treated the same in society. There are gender norms and racial norms that are in this country. And the same can be said for people of color, newcomers to Canada, Indigenous peoples. If you identify as gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual, two-spirit, queer, that you're not treated the same in society as well. So I think we treat everybody the same comes from good intended people, but ultimately, again, it's a tactic to get racism or inequity off the table for discussion. So it's very harmful language when we say things like we just treat everybody the same, because the fact is we don't treat everybody the same, and not everybody experiences our reality in society the same. It perpetuates the harm. The third misconception is racism does not exist here. So people might accept racism exists in Canada, which is a big hurdle for a lot of people, but it's a very common one where people say, yeah, racism exists, but not in my department, not in my team, not with the people I work with. That happens somewhere else, which leads me to my fourth misconception, which is racism is easy to spot. Racism is not easy to spot. 90% of racist acts, behaviors, or systemic manifestations are covert, meaning that they're socially acceptable, or they're socially hidden forms of racism that we're perfectly okay with. or not, maybe we're not okay with them, but we just haven't had the opportunity to see them for what they are, elements and manifestations of racism. So here's an example of just how hard it is to see racism within this country. This context is very specifically looking towards the Indigenous context of widespread anti-Indigenous racism. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, 10% of racism is overt, meaning that these are things we cannot stand for. We do not tolerate this in our country. Mind you, I was watching the news this morning and there's a spike in hate crimes and racism that I'm seeing in the news and the media. But we have those spikes that happened. But for the vast majority of us as a population, these are things we just don't stand for, right? But they make up such a small percentage of racist acts and manifestations. So that's above the surface. That's the tip of the iceberg. And we know these when we see these, right? Genocide, discrimination laws, microaggressions, hate crimes, racial slurs, and racist jokes. As Canadian citizens, usually we're like, oh, we can't stand that. That's inappropriate behavior. You need to stop that inappropriate behavior. So again, that just makes up a very small percentage of the racism that exists within this country. The 90% of racism acts and manifestations out there are covert, meaning they're socially acceptable or hidden forms. This looks like Amber Alerts, mass incarceration, the high rate of dropouts we see among Indigenous students in both elementary, secondary, and post-secondary. When people say things like Indigenous peoples just need to get over it, which I'm pretty sure we have all heard at some point. If you ever hear that term or that phrase, Indigenous peoples just need to get over it, what people are really telling you is that Indigenous peoples should surrender their human rights for the comfort of settlers. That's what people are really saying when they're saying Indigenous peoples should just get over it. It's coming from colonial ideology. Colonial ideology is this belief that Indigenous peoples are less deserving, less worthy people. And that's what gives the ecosystem, the environment for people to have widespread anti-Indigenous sentiments. It's coming from colonial ideology. And it's important that, because I hear that one often, right? Indigenous peoples just need to get over it. That's what people are saying really at the end of the day. An important takeaway too is that Indigenous rights are exactly that. They are human rights. And in this country, we spend a lot of money and a lot of time talking about and defending and protecting the human rights of people in this country, but also countries across the world. We spend millions and millions of dollars in aid to ease the suffering of people who have their human rights being taken away from them. But in this country, we're very okay with this common phrase, Indigenous peoples just need to get over it. But we need to make those clear linkages, right? And name it for what it is. It's colonial ideology, and it's saying that Indigenous people should surrender their human rights. Economic violence. An example of economic violence would be the Canadian government, our current Canadian government, who made very strong promises to advancing reconciliation in this country. But after being elected, bought out an oil pipeline in the amount of $5 billion to ensure that that pipeline would continue to go through traditional territories in the north of this province. Now, I don't know about you, but $5 billion is an awful lot of money. And I imagine that in the spirit of reconciliation, the government could have bought another kind of pipeline, such as a clean drinking water pipeline to get clean drinking water to Indigenous communities in this country who have never once had access to clean drinking water. And that's something we take for granted, isn't it? I mean, that's a privilege that we have as people in this part of the world, that when we turn on our kitchen tap, we don't have to think twice about if it's safe to drink. When we hop in the shower this morning, we didn't have to think about what kind of water was coming out. We take that for granted. But that's an example of economic violence. Maltreatment in healthcare, poverty, clean access to water, clean water access, education access, tokenism, cultural appropriation, Not learning about Indigenous people in school. Think back to when you were in elementary school or high school, or when you were immigrating to Canada. Did you have an opportunity to learn about Indigenous history, culture, or peoples? If you did, you were very lucky. The vast majority of us had zero exposure to any Indigenous curriculum in our educational experiences. But we're actively working on that. Those of you who have children in school today, you know full well that they're being exposed to all kinds of curriculum and culture that they're coming home and telling you about at the dinner table conversations. RCMP and police brutality. I mean, when the murder of George Floyd happened in the year 2020, that sparked a huge conversation here in Canada as well, and talking about police brutality against Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And I remember in that same summer that had happened, there was a very brave police chief, mind you, ill-informed police chief, who came before a press conference, right? This police chief came before the news and the media and said what? There's no such thing as systemic racism in the RCMP. That tells me that very brave, but mind you, ill-informed police chief has no account of our history in this country. Little does that police chief know that the RCMP was born out of racism. The RCMP was created out of one mandate, and it was to forcibly remove Indigenous peoples from our lands and territories and place us onto the reservation system. Once that job was done, the next marching orders were that RCMP steal our children from our families and our communities and put us into the residential school system. So it's all kinds of inaccurate disinformation for a police chief to proclaim that there's no such thing as systemic racism in the RCMP. Child theft, land theft and exploitation, settler saviorism, assimilation, the reward for conformity, racial profiling, Indigenous stereotypes, and manufactured consent. So these are all examples of the widespread systemic racism that exists, but we as everyday working professionals have little time or opportunity to pause and just see what is being scaffolded here in this country. So this is a lot, I know, but this is exactly why we're here. This is why we're having this conversation. And this is why we need the anti-racism tools and cultural safety tools in our professional tool belt to start naming these things. If we name them, we can address them. And if we can address them, we can dismantle them and make them safer and more just and more equitable. It's also important to know that there are varying degrees, varying levels, I will say, of anti-Indigenous racism. And this is racism for any type of peoples who are experiencing racism. There's internalized racism, and we have a lot of this in our culture today. And it's only natural given how colonialism has impacted and continues to impact our cultural identity and access to our culture and access to our communities and access to our territories. There are a lot of, Indigenous colleagues, friends, relatives, who are really struggling with internalized racism. And I see this among a lot of young people today who are on their own discovery of what it means to be Indigenous in the 21st century, given what we've gone through. There's also interpersonal racism, which is how we treat one another as human beings. Then there's institutional racism. Institutional racism would be more along the lines of the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in jails and prisons in this country. Pick any prison, juvenile, men's or women's prison, do a scan of the population, and you'll probably find an overwhelming overrepresentation of Indigenous inmates in that institution. And then systemic racism. Systemic racism is how our systems actively scaffold Indigenous racism today. So an example of systemic racism would be the continued forced removal, the theft of our children from our mothers and fathers and families. We often associate assimilation as something in the past through the residential schools in the 60s scoop. But it's something that's alive and well today, that is now perpetuated by systemic racism that continues to remove our children from our families. So what I mean by that is our Ministry of Children and Family Services, MCFD, actively incentivizes the removal of children. You know, INAC, Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, spends millions and millions of dollars a year by giving that money to MCFD to top up the allowances for families who will take on Indigenous children and youth, when we could be giving those millions and millions of dollars to the families to give them the adequate resources to keep their children so they don't have to be re-traumatized and forcibly removed from our communities. That's an example of systemic racism. We incentivize the forced removal of our children and our youth. That's one of many examples of systemic racism that is alive and well today. Okay, so that's just kind of like why we're here. That's why we're having the conversation. Now let's switch gears and talk a little bit about some of those tools that I can offer you. So these are my 3 favorite tools, and I say they're my favorite because they come up probably the most for me. With all that's going on in the country today, there's a lot of othering of people. Sometimes I feel like there's a growing divide. And so there's a lot of this clash of identities in society that we see today. And that's only natural with the more we create more diverse and inclusive spaces that are equitable, you know, the more we're going to have a clash of identities. And so I learned this early on as I started teaching allyship and anti-racism for the Indigenous context. There are 3 common trigger words for people, and they would come up quite often in my classrooms. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to move this to the beginning of the course and disarm people, because a lot of people felt like their identities were being attacked in those spaces. And that's usually where resistance comes from when we want to be anti-racist. It usually is coming from this place of like, I need to protect my identity. And so usually there's resistance. And so these are the 3 most common forms of resistance that I found. And these are what I also call trigger words. And so I offer this as a way to begin a conversation so that we are disarming people. So the first trigger word is decolonization. A lot of people think that decolonization really is about a divisiveness, like the colonized versus the colonizer, the settler versus Indigenous folks. And I'm like, no, that's really not the essence and the beauty of what decolonization can be, but it can be a trigger word for some people. Prejudice, big trigger word for a lot of people. And there's a lot of misconceptions about the word prejudice. Usually it's painted within a good bad binary, like to have prejudice is to be bad, and you're not a bad person, so you can't have prejudice, right? Little do we know that prejudice is natural, it's innate, it's inside you, it's inside me, and it's 100% impossible to be without prejudice, because we're only, yes, we're in a multicultural society, but we're only born into one cultural framework, and that's the framework of our caregivers. So it's only natural when we go in and are exposed and witness other people's cultures, we're gonna have judgments about them. The first time you see somebody who looks different than you have judgments about them. The first time you hear different language from your language, you have judgments about that. The first time you see interpersonal connections between family members or friends from a different culture, you're going to have judgments about that. I mean, if you've ever been to the United States, right? Have you ever had judgments about American culture? You know, all of us have. So it's only natural that prejudice is natural and innate inside every single one of us. So it doesn't have to be a trigger word. Prejudice could be your power word, right? I've transformed what I thought was prejudice, which is it was bad, and I've transformed it into my own power word, where I've owned that I have prejudices. And so I stopped asking myself if I am being prejudiced. And I started seriously asking myself, how am I being prejudiced? How am I being prejudiced when I'm dropping my daughter off at school? How am I being prejudiced when I'm holding space and delivering a classroom presentation? How am I being prejudiced when I'm in the grocery store lineup, interacting with the front desk clerk, right? Or with the cashier clerk? If you can train yourself to ask this question, how are you being prejudiced in the work you do or in your life? you put yourself in this magical zone for critical self-reflection, where you can be with your biases, you can examine your privileges, and you can examine the next best possible step you can do to be more equitable, more anti-racist, or culturally safer. And then privilege is a big one. You know, I would drop the P word, privilege, in sessions, and people would be like, oh, Len, I don't have any privilege. I had to work really hard to get where I'm at. I didn't have everything handed to me. Or I'm not racist. I don't have privilege. And I'm like, that's great. That has nothing to do with privilege. Privilege has nothing to do with being racist, or that you're a bad person, or that you never had to struggle, or you had everything handed to you in life. That has nothing to do with privilege. I'll talk more about privilege on later slides. But again, we want to disarm people into being resistant to those conversations. So here are the ways that I disarm people. Decolonization is for everyone, and everyone benefits from the good work of decolonization work. It's 100% impossible to be without prejudice. So again, not if I'm being prejudiced, how am I being prejudiced in the work that I'm doing? And of course, knowing and understanding that privilege does not mean you are racist. The image that you see here, this is privilege 101. You know, privilege refers to certain social advantages and benefits that you have by belonging to a certain group. Privilege has nothing to do with being racist, not that you haven't had to work hard, that you've had everything handed to you, you never struggled. It's nothing to feel guilty or ashamed of. The example that I like to use is if you are a left-handed person, right? Or if you know somebody who's in your family, your husband, your wife, your partner, your children, a best friend who is a left-handed person, who do you think is at more of an advantage or benefits from society, left-handed people or right-handed people? As a right-handed person, I can tell you, I didn't know the left-handed person's struggle, that zippers, can openers, bank teller pens, or desks in the university that fold in this way. I did not know that I had a right-handed privilege until I had this conversation with left-handed people. So that's an example of privilege, right? Because the society is designed with right-handed people in mind. The same can be said for able-bodied people. If you've never had to worry about how you're going to get to, you know, the second or third floor because the elevator or the escalator is broken, then, you know, that's a testament of how able-bodied we are. And that's an example of our privilege. Other factors and, you know, advantages or identities that we might be carrying that help us understand what our privilege might exist is, you know, how able-bodied we are, the languages we speak, sexual orientation, gender, citizenship status, religious, the class you belong to. These are all different factors in where you might be able to determine how much privilege you have within society. So becoming anti-racist really is around getting out of our comfort zone and getting out of the fear zone. So it's important to know this. I would hold this yellow circle you see on the screen here, I would hold as a mirror, right? Where do we feel like we are in terms of our own professional practice, but also our own professional team? Where do we kind of land in this trajectory of aiming or aspiring to be anti-racist? You know, are we in the fear zone where we deny that racism is a thing, that we avoid hard conversations, we strive for to be comfortable in our places of work, and we only talk to people who look and talk like us? That's the comfort zone, the fear zone. We can go from the fear zone into the learning zone, where we are understanding that we all have some degree of privilege. We seek out questions that make us uncomfortable. We recognize racism as a present and current problem, and we're educating ourselves about race and structural racism. The growth zone, which is you know, where a lot of the change will start to begin, is when we don't let mistakes deter us from doing this work. We speak out when we see racism. We're not afraid of being in the discomfort of having these conversations. And We, surround ourselves with others who think and look differently than ourselves. That's the growth zone. So we want to lean more towards there. But I'd like to add a different zone, which I call the transformational zone, where we continually change and revise our policies. We promote leaders who have this track record or this demonstration for being anti-racist. We embrace our discomfort. We support each other to speak up on racism. We educate each other, hold each other accountable, willingly yield our positions of power to marginalized voices. I don't like the word marginalization, so I use it quite interchangeably with marginalized, targeted, vulnerable. It really depends on the context. But in this regard, when we look in colonial systems, quite often, people of color, people with disabilities are in the margins of society and in those colonial spaces. And of course, we're really always striving. We're in this zone of always wanting to strive to deepen our diverse relationships. So another tool that I will offer you is, continuously asking ourselves, how do we, right? If we're in this active state of aspiring, we want to make sure that this question or these questions are hardwired into daily, weekly, monthly operational planning for our teams and organizations. How do we continually change and revise policies? How do we promote leaders who are anti-racist? How do we embrace our discomfort? By making it a practice that we are asking ourselves these questions, we're always checking in. We're always in that zone of reflection. We're always in that zone of, what are we missing? Who's missing from this conversation? So the zone of humility will help us kind of like take a step back and look for more opportunities to embed anti-racism, cultural safety, and decolonial work. So I'm not going to talk about these. I did talk about these in the Indigenous allyship, but we do have these 3 tools that we can put in our professional tool belt, right? How to talk about racism. Well, there's call out culture, where you use calling out racism to shut it down. Then there's also call in, which is not the same as calling out. This is the tool, as a little bit of a recap, this is the tool we use to work with peers, friends, colleagues, people we're in a relationship with, where we want to address racism, but we want to be more healthier and constructive out of those conversations. And then, of course, there's lean in culture, right? Lean in culture is referring to that we are proactive and that we're okay, we're comfortable, we encourage talking about diversity, equity, injustice, and we're comfortable talking about race and racism and cultural differences. We bring that into the space and we create this workplace culture where we feel like we are practicing using those tools to talk about racism, prejudice, power, privilege, colonialism, oppression. We want to bring those into the spaces so we feel like we have tools that we can use to be anti-racist. Here's some other, I would say, this is me just putting all of my tools on the table. Please take one, leave one if you would like. So the first tool, which I've already mentioned, is, stop asking yourself if you are being prejudiced. Start asking yourself, how am I being prejudiced in the work that I am doing? How am I being prejudiced when I'm dropping my children off at school? When I'm talking with the front office staff? Number 2, listen twice as often as you speak. We also covered that one in our Indigenous allyship session. Celebrate courageous conversations. Mobilize your curiosity and your empathy. Oh, here's an important one. Don't rush to fix something. We do live in a fix-it culture, but arguably, racism, cultural safety, decolonization work is not going to happen overnight. And we don't want to, skip over the validation that racism exists. So if a friend or a colleague or a patient or a client, somebody your organization works with, ever comes forward and says, I've just experienced a racist event, often if we haven't prepared with developing the foundation of being comfortable and okay talking about racism, and I've seen this with so many organizations across Canada, they try to skip over it. It's like, what? No, in this team, in this organization, no, we're really super chill, we're super friendly here. I'm pretty sure that's not what it was. And so we invalidate that, right? So that's like completely avoiding the topic of it. But at the same time, some people just want to rush to fix it. So we want to make sure that we pause, slow things down, and this is not about fixing it. Seek guidance on the clarification of your role. So whether you're a leader, a frontline service provider, an advocate, no matter where you are in the organization, your role might look a lot different talking about racism. And so check in with your peers, your colleagues, your friends, and have that open conversation, that open dialogue. What is my role? And what should be my role if I see elements or acts of racism or discrimination in the workplace? Seek clarification, talk it out. That just really solidifies yourself in the work, and it also positions yourself in the work as well. And then you will find your own boundaries, your healthy boundaries for leaning in and leaning out of conversations. We can't be afraid to name it, right? And work with it. Fear will always be a big barrier. So I would say one of the greatest tools you can take back and embed into your professional practice is working with our fears and naming our fears. Fear gets a negative rap in our professional work, right? But fear is not a bad thing in this regard. This will require you to act or to respond in the future. To be anti-racist requires action. And so, and this is what I do in my own professional practice, I'm always preparing myself for the moment where I will have to respond. And I have responded. But the magic will happen when you are doing the internal work. Mentally and emotionally, you're preparing yourself for that moment. You're visualizing yourself in a moment. So if I'm ever in public, and this has happened a few times, where I'm seeing some tension between two other strangers in public, and I'm sensing it's a racist moment, and I'm like, oh Lord, I think this is my moment. I think I'm going to have to respond or something, then call this what it is. It's racism, right? And then it takes care of itself. And I'm like, thank gosh, I thought I was going to have to respond there. Because there is that healthy level of fear where you're going to have to respond to elements of racist acts. So I would say learn to work with your fear too, and do the internal work of preparing for the moment when you might have to respond. Champion anti-racism policies and projects within your organization. If you don't have any anti-racism projects or policies, that's just a good sign to maybe start talking about, should we be creating an anti-racism policy or a project, or cultural safety or reconciliation, something to bring back to the team to have a greater dialogue on. And then always commit to one thing, next thing. This just keeps one foot in front of the other on your journey towards that transformational zone, that change zone. So maybe you're still in the learning zone, right? Then you're in the learning zone and there's nothing wrong with that. But start to ask yourself or tell yourself, where's your next opportunity? What do you want to learn about next? Where will you go to seek further information? And then commit to it. So with that, that was my elevator pitch on my favorite tools that I've picked up along the way. So we have about 15 minutes worth of open Q&A. I have some questions coming in the Q&A function. If you're more comfortable like speaking to add further context, or that's just your preference, feel free to raise your hand. It will give me the opportunity to unmute you, or give you the privilege to unmute yourself. There's the P word, the privilege to unmute yourself, so you can bring that question in as well. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen here and then answer some questions that are coming up for folks. Hopefully that was helpful. Oh, good question. How would you describe the term settler saviorism, and how can white settlers avoid this versus feeling like they want to do the social justice cause? Good question. So settler saviorism is, I would define it as, settlers, which are people who are not Indigenous in this context of Canada, who are not First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and that's the settler. The saviorism part is if they're learning about the injustices that we've experienced as Indigenous peoples for the first time. It's been my experience that sometimes, like, these are hard to have conversations, right? These are hard learnings. Learning about the residential schools, genocide, state violence against Indigenous peoples. It's very natural, a very natural human response for us to want to protect, defend, be activists in these spaces, but sometimes there also lies a pitfall. And that pitfall is when people are learning about these, they're driven for action, they're driven for change, but ultimately their change looks like where they go out there in the world and they just want to save all the Indigenous people. And I'm like, hold up, please don't go out there saving Indigenous people, because we don't need saving, right? And we don't need to be held up. We got our own people for that. We got our own communities for that, who keep us going and push us forward, but we don't need saving. What we do need are allies. And an ally is not the same as a savior. Allies will stand beside us, stand behind us, and stand with us in our time of need and follow our leadership and follow our agenda. So how do you navigate the ally versus savior mentality? A savior will come from a charity model. And a charity model looks like somebody going into an Indigenous context and saying, I'm here to help you, I'm going to do this for you, and you're going to like it, right? That's the charity settler savior syndrome. An ally will come into an Indigenous context with a social justice framework and say, I'm here to help, boss me around, right? That servant mentality of seeking the knowledge, seeking the agenda from the Indigenous peoples. What do they want? And then following suit. So that's how you work within that context of making sure that it's being driven and led by Indigenous voices, not us coming in and thinking we're going to fix it for them. And it happens more often than not at an organizational type of way. How do you balance the willingness to engage with others who think differently to us, with knowing to set our own boundaries based on our personal beliefs and therefore choosing not to engage? For example, some of my values are non-negotiable, but others may just see it as differences of opinion. That's a really good question. I think that these are, it always depends on the context, right? I don't know the context in which you work, but ultimately what we want are more exposure to these different ideas. Doesn't mean you always have to agree with them. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have to like the people, right? There are always going to be non-negotiables. But if you're transparent with your non-negotiables, people are going to sense your boundaries, right? And so we all have non-negotiables. And those non-negotiables are not bad things. Us coming together and being with our different selves doesn't mean that we have to like each other or that it's always going to be easy, right? But respect and dignity should always be at the core of us being engaging with people who are different from us. Because we can't fight oppression with oppression. So if somebody's being oppressive in that manner, I'm like, okay, right? And then you kind of have to just kind of carry on and be about your business, I would say. Sometimes people get the wrong idea when you say the word anti-racism. I think all they hear is the word racism and shut down listening. Yes, absolutely. The R word, like some people are even afraid of saying racism. And again, that's coming from the fear zone, probably from people who have never had an opportunity to be in these spaces of learning. And I fully honor and recognize the group that I'm talking to too. There's something, your comfort level and ready level to be here, right? It's those people that are not coming into these spaces. So I'm preaching to the choir a little bit, even if you're YouTubing this later on in the future, right? There is a thing I've noticed where the people who are often in the space, not always the people who need to be in the space. But racism, absolutely, it can be a trigger word for people, but it comes from misconceptions about racism. And the biggest misconception is racism is a bad thing, right? That's this good, bad binary, that if we bring up racism, that means I'm a bad person or I'm going to feel guilty in these spaces. And I'm like, that has nothing to do with what we want to talk about, but you got to own your own feelings there because I'm not going to own that for you. What is an example of manufactured consent in the iceberg? Ooh, really good question. So we have this thing in this country today where we have a lot of duty to consult or are mandated to consult with Indigenous communities for things like economic development, for business strategies and business development. Manufactured consent looks like, and I'm just going to be transparent with you, in my own community of Keatsie, we have a pipeline that's going through our territory too. And the government presented us with options to give them consent for that pipeline to go through because they needed the consent. And so the government came into our community and says, okay, you have two choices. Choice number A, you give us the permission to build this pipeline, right? And we'll give you certain revenues that will benefit, certain benefits that will go along with this pipeline development. Option B, you fight us in court, you will pay the expenses of your legal bills, and that pipeline is still going through. So with both options, that pipeline is still going through, right? This is a negotiation with the federal government. I call that manufactured consent, because consent requires that somebody has the full autonomy and the sovereignty to say no, right? We teach this in college and university and high school today. No means no, right? But this manufactured consent is like, well, here's the choices you have before you, choice A, choice B. And it's giving us this illusion that we have some choice or that we have some opportunity, when really those opportunities are quite limited. That's what I call examples of systemic racism, manufactured consent. Such good information. Can you go back to the slide with the questions that we need to ask daily? How do we incorporate these into daily practice as a part of our process and get a pass if we don't have time for that argument? Yeah, really good question. I'll bring it back up just before we close up our session here. How do we incorporate this into a daily practice as a part of our process and get a pass if we don't have the time for that argument? So my argument would be is if time is also a really big barrier, and thank you for bringing that into the space here. Time is often brought into spaces as a barrier. And one of the things I always say is time should never be a barrier for social justice work, for equity work, diversity work, cultural safety work, reconciliation work. Time is always going to be a barrier for something, right? But I never want time to be like this untouchable barrier. So people often tell me, Len, we don't have time for that. I get it from doctors who say they don't have time to see all their patients with compassion. And I'm like, okay, it only takes 40 seconds to ask your patient, how are you doing? Is everything okay? How are you feeling? Is there anything we could do better? 40 seconds. And we have science and literature to show that. Teachers will say, this sounds great, Len, but we don't have the time. We have way too many students. So time can often be used as a tool to counter your work in anti-racism by, again, trying to force us to remove it. Like, oh, this untouchable thing called time. I'm like, I'm far much more interested in how we can work with time. If it's a barrier, put it back on the table. Let's talk about it. I just want to talk about it. I have questions about this thing you think you don't have time for. Because in this society, in this culture, in this country, we have a lot of time for things we think are important. We do, don't we? We spend a lot of time on things and projects we find very important. So I would question, why is it not important enough to give it more time? That's a strategy that I use. And it probably, really, people are like, oh God, there goes Len again, Len's on his thing. But that's the work that I'm called to do. How do we incorporate this into a daily practice? I would just say, to me, and I've used this in certain teams that I work with, it might not have to be daily, it might be weekly. So if you have weekly team meetings, monthly team meetings, I would put that image on the screen and be like, I just want to offer this for some food for thought. Or if you're in a place of leading teams, right? How do we ask these questions? If you're in a place of offering performance reviews, or if you're in a place where you have, annual reviews of your work, I would make a commitment for yourself, right? This is what I'm committed to, asking myself these questions. Those are just a couple of ways you can mobilize that work moving forward. Yeah, another question about the manufactured consent. Okay, can you please give an example of calling in when you have heard a very racist remark from somebody in a position of leadership or power? Yeah, absolutely. So an example of calling in, and I've done this with leaders, they have said, they've offered a racist remark or an example of discrimination in a space. And so calling in would be, if you've heard it, and you don't want to call the person out because that's not going to be healthy and it's not going to be constructive, because likely that person is to respond with resistance, right? And be like, nope, I'm not a bad person. I'm a good person. I'm a good leader. That was not what you see and that was not what you heard. And they're just going to dismantle everything that you're bringing to the space. So an example of calling in would be waiting until you're no longer public in front of the eye of the team. And you say, hey, can I talk with you for a second? I have some feedback for you. Offer feedback. Ask for permission first. Can I talk to you? Can I offer you some feedback? 2 strategies. The next thing is you say, explain what your relationship is with that person, right? I enjoy working with you. No, I'm not saying that this is what I would always say, but this is what I would say to somebody, is usually you want to let them know where you're coming from. So I enjoy working with you, but I've observed you to be a really great leader in all of these areas. But I wanted to share some feedback with you because it didn't align with what you've been showing me earlier. And so I thought you might want to know about that, because it probably felt that way for other people too. So you make it about their behavior, not about their identity, not about that person being a bad person or a bad leader. Make it about the behavior, and then offer what it is that you witnessed and observed in terms of behavior and why it was inappropriate, or culturally unsafe, or outright racist. And go along with some education too, right? I've learned through these webinars that I've been attending, this book that I read, that this is a microaggression, or this is racism, or that this is discriminatory in nature. And I wanted to let you know that, because I would want to know if I said something like that and it landed with other folks, I want to be able to receive that same type of feedback. And I just wanted to offer that to you. So you ask for permission, you you ask for permission, ask if you can give them some feedback. It's about the behavior, not about the person, and you offer the education. And then you also let them know that you're willing to receive feedback as well. That will be calling in racism. And whether it's with leadership or not, you want to respond. A lot of people will feel intimidated by responding to a boss or a leader. I tell you, every time I respond to leadership, they're for the most part, very appreciative of it, especially if you handle it in that kind of strategy. Because leaders want to know feedback. The best leaders will want to know feedback, but ultimately you want to respond to some way. If you do not respond, that will eat away at you, not just in that day, the week, and months following it. I've worked with so many people who said, I can think back to like an event I saw 2 years ago, Len, and it's still bugging me today because I didn't say a thing. And I didn't say anything because I didn't have the tools that we've just talked about today. So you want to, again, prepare for that response. You want to respond. If you don't, it'll eat away at you. And I don't want that for you. How do you navigate through feelings of shame to move onto something that is productive? Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I would say that shame is not a bad thing, right? I think the only way we can get through shame is when we name it. When we name it and express it, then we can let go of it. We can process it. A lot of people who are in that zone of shame, like when I talk about anti-Indigenous racism, people say things to me like, Len, how can I be proud to be a Canadian citizen knowing all of the things that are going on? I'm like, that's a good question. I would say, you don't have to surrender your pride at the door to be a citizen here, but to lean into cultural safety and anti-racism work. We think in this dichotomy, we think in black and white, right? But it doesn't mean that we can only be one thing. We are dynamic human beings in a very, dynamic society. So you want to pick your moments for being a proud Canadian, right? As a parent, I'm a very proud parent. But does it mean that I'm a proud parent when my child does something wrong or makes a mistake, or so it's like, no, that those emotions come, right? And you want to own them in those moments. So if you're feeling shame, name it, bring it into the space, express it, and then you can start to kind of retire it. So thank you for that. My dear friends and relatives, we are 1 o'clock on the dot, and I know you all have very busy schedules, and so I will not keep you 1 minute after 1 o'clock. And then I have another meeting that I need to get to too. So thank you so much for listening, learning, and leaning into this conversation on anti-racism tools. Hopefully you have found that familiar. Thank you so much for returning to these conversations. Next month, we have a whole other rotating table of topics that we want to bring to these open online spaces. So I look forward to seeing you all at those future sessions. Have a great rest of your day, everybody. Bye.